we might get started. You're starting just with me, but we have some really cool people joining us this evening from our community. I'm really keen to have a chat with them and with you guys more widely. I'm going to start with just a little bit of an overview and welcome on the evening. So, as I say, welcome. Thanks for joining us online. I really prefer doing this in person so that we can all talk. Not only can I talk to you, but you guys can talk to each other. But obviously that's not the reality that we live in. And in any world, I think that there's great value in having this online portion of our community as well as a physical version in an ideal world, given that we're not all in the same space geographically, and this does give us an opportunity to share this more widely. So I'm from Betfair. My job at Betfair is to support people who are interested in automation and modelling and to help to grow this community. Now, Betfair, our vision, our mission is to create more winners. That's why we're here. The way I see that in my role is to enable you guys to get better at what you do, particularly through API access, automation and data, and through community, which is what this is about. So I don't pretend to know everything, but I know a lot of people who have an awful lot of experience and knowledge and great opinions, and that's what this is about, is sharing those experiences of people who have some real runs on the board as far as I'm concerned. So this evening, we're going to talk to two of our very successful modelers on the exchange, Jason Wong and Paul Smith. I'm very grateful to both of them for joining us and being so open and prepared to share their experiences and opinions with us. Obviously, that can be a tricky thing to ask of people, and I'm very grateful to them for being prepared to. I'll do a one-on-one with each of the guys, talk a little bit about their background, their experience, where they come from, how they found the exchange, and then we'll throw open to questions from you guys. I've got a couple I want to use to start, some things that have been thrown around on the Slack community. But then it's open to you guys. So at the bottom of your Zoom page, there's a little Q&A box. Now, if you click on that anytime through the hour, you can type questions into it. We won't necessarily answer them straight away. We will try and get through as many as we can during the hour. I will also try to keep it to an hour. But then any that we don't, we will try and pick up over on the Slack community more generally so that the conversation can continue. So we will talk about Slack a little bit through the evening. So really cool community group, I guess. Conversation that keeps going over there was a group that was started by one of my customers in this space, community owned, community led. I just like being able to talk to you guys in that space. So if you're not already part of the Betfair Quants Slack group, feel free to shoot an email through and we can send you an invitation if you don't know anyone who's already in there. You can get us on api@betfair.com.au. I think Ben will post that down below so that you've got that email address if you want to join the conversation over there as well. So without further ado, Jace, can I have your video so I'm not on screen on my own anymore? Hello.
That work? Hey.
How are you?
Good.
Awesome. Now, you are probably one of the better known faces in our community because you are generally a bit more open about talking about your experiences and your background, which I'm very grateful for, and we are more generally. But for anyone who doesn't know who you are, and I'm sure that we've got lots who don't, can you talk a little bit about your background? So where do you come from pre-Betfair?
Yeah, so pre-Betfair, I was, I guess, just like most people, working a corporate job. So I was in banking for about 10, 11 years, working in a couple of Sydney banks. My role there was in the quant team, so basically creating models to price financial instruments for the bank. So that would be loans, options, various things, mainly in the risk management space. And then about 3 years ago, I started dabbling into sports models, specifically AFL and NRL. And then it's kind of just grown from there. Probably discovered Betfair automation about 2.5 years ago, and that's made things a lot easier for me.
So coming from that financial background, how did you go about modeling sport? So you're not a big sport person by background, are you? Like,
Originally not. I mean, I probably wouldn't. I like to watch sports. Before that, I probably had never put a bet on sports, whether recreationally or trying to make money. So I approached it basically how I'd approach a financial modeling problem. I guess it's not exactly the same. You're not going to be able to take a formula you have in the financial world and apply it to sports, but I think a lot of the same techniques are there in terms of, you're trying to get your variables, what variables are most predictive, and kind of isolate them and just iterate until you come up with a successful model. And I think luckily back then, especially AFL was probably a bit softer than it is now. So it gave me a bit of confidence to keep pursuing it. If I started now, I probably would have stopped.
especially with AFL.
Yeah.
Starting with AFL, one of the things that I find fascinating about you is you started there, which isn't where you normally do, as someone trying to model the exchange. But then you've moved into so many other sports. So I know you play tennis a bit, you've got models on racing, greyhounds. Is it the same approach that you've taken to the different models? So the different, modeling the different codes and sports, or how much did you have to learn about those?
I probably, most of the stuff that I do now, or a high proportion of it, is now market-based modeling. I think I've described it before in another catch-up, but originally I did most of my modeling, which was form-based. So the way I describe that is like you're trying to predict what the outcome of a certain match is. So in an AFL example, you're trying to predict what the fair line or the fair odd should be in a certain game. But right now, especially with the API, I've been doing a lot more market-based stuff, which is probably less concerned with what the actual fair odds are, but just trying to predict where the market is going to move and either hold your position or trade out of it. Most of the time I hold my position, just trying to find out when there's an inefficiency in the market and trade into that, and hoping that I've beaten the final price. Then BSP is usually a pretty good guide. But I guess probably I would say about 50% of my action on Betfair now is market-based rather than form-based.
I love that you're an example of someone who does both. So when I talk about different automated strategies, I'll say that there are basically three ways you can approach it. So you can look at trying to come up with a rating, a price, and then bet based on that price. The other extreme is that you just play the market, like you were saying, that you try to predict which way it's going and then you react to that. And then in an ideal world, you combine the two and you trade the market and then come up with a position, which I think is some of what you sort of come to. When you're building models on new markets that you haven't come across before, so let's say when you first started building a greyhound model, what sort of data were you using as the basis of that? Was it historical pricing data? Was it the stream recordings, or what sort of things were you using?
The way I tend to approach things is I try not to, and I know there's a lot of debate around this, and some of the most successful modelers do use the price in it, but I try to not use the price initially in my model and try to come up with a fair prediction of each runner's price without using any sort of market input. And then afterwards, I might try to use some kind of market-based input into that to try to ground it a bit. So for greyhounds, for example, I just basically use the last 10 years of data off the dog's website. And now I've been using a bit more sophisticated data, but that's what I started off with. And I think you can do quite a lot with stuff that's already is freely available, especially with greyhounds, which might be a bit softer. But at the same time, you don't have the luxury of a deep liquidity pool like horse racing in greyhounds. So one of the lessons that I learned with greyhounds was that, especially because I'm probably a bigger better than most average people, I was affecting the market a lot. So the back test probably wasn't as accurate as I would have liked.
That's one we can pick up later. I love that. So the other one I want to throw at you before we jump across to Paul for a minute is around the AFL. So obviously COVID has been very interesting for a lot of us. It has thrown a lot of worlds upside down, including the AFL. Now, obviously one of the rules of betting based on a model is that when you think your inputs might have changed, you're careful with your model. Did you manage to adjust for this insane season that we're in?
So I made the call early in the year just not to bet AFL or NRL. So I haven't touched it. I did run the model a couple of weeks ago just to see how well it would have done, and it would have done really, really poorly. So good call.
Doesn't surprise me. A good example of that sort of risk management approach.
Yeah, I think you got to know when to get out, just as important as when to scale things up.
That can be a really hard judgment call, so good on you for making it. All right, I'm going to get you to turn your camera off if you can, Jace, and I'll swap across to Paul. There you go. Hello. You're a less well-known voice in our community, so I'm even more grateful in some respects for you for joining us, Paul. But you have an even longer history on the exchange than Jason, who, as he said, is fairly recent in the the long-term view of how long we've been around.
Yep.
How long have you been on the exchange?
I can't remember when I started, but it's probably at least 15 years, I would say.
A little longer.
So, quite a while. But I probably wasted the first 10 years, realistically, in just not having the appetite for risk.
Yeah, that's a really tricky one. I think particularly for people who aren't coming from a more wagering background and have more of an analytical approach. So your background, so you talk about your day job. What's your day job? What's your pre-bet then?
So my day job is a data architect, so it's in IT. And I started as a software developer. I guess at the time when Betfair was around, the API, I wanted to learn how to use REST. It was a REST API at the time.
Okay.
And it seemed like a good thing, bit of a challenge. Can you beat the markets? So I started with $100 and never really added to that $100. And that's grown over the 15 years, I guess.
So when you started looking at the markets, were you like Jason taking a form approach to your modeling, or were you looking at price models, or how?
Yep. So form-based, and I still do a lot of form-based models. The tip is, I guess, around form-based models, I don't use what's available to everyone. So a lot of people buy data, a lot of people grab the free data that's easily downloadable via CSVs. I will generally scan the whole web and grab a lot of data that's not typical for most people, whether that be weather data or taking the data that's there and deriving it, or different ratings that people put out for free. Pretty much anywhere you can get data, I'll try to get it.
So you're trying to find some of your edge by using different inputs, not just how
Exactly.
That makes sense.
Exactly.
When you started, what did you model first? Was it racing? Was it greys? What was your first?
It was thoroughbreds, yeah. It was started with that. Probably did harness just because it was in the same event code on Betfair. And worked out, paces and trots and a harness, and they basically have a different shape to their market. Then got into greyhounds, then probably the correct scores on soccer, and then just kept branching out.
And what do you mainly bet these days?
So mainly is thoroughbreds, harness, greyhounds would be my 95% of my turnover.
Yeah, well, in Australia, that definitely makes sense.
Yeah.
But
globally, obviously.
Yeah, I'm glad. So with your models, how much do they change over time? Obviously, 15 years is a long time.
Yeah, so I tend to work a lot on my models, probably a lot more than what most people do. I'd probably spend a minimum of 4 hours every day, and probably 8 hours on a weekend, like each day. On top of my day job, but I enjoy it. So I'll get up in the morning, I'll tinker for a couple of hours before everyone else gets up, and then go work all day, and then come home and tinker with the models for the next 4 hours or so till I go to bed.
And it's maybe a dissenting opinion. How much of that do you think is productive? Do you think it's overfit, or do you know?
I try lots of things and they don't work.
Yep.
So I fail probably more than most people do. I would probably create 1 or 2 models every day and try to adjust them slightly and see how it goes, and then monitor it. So I'll generally just keep creating models and monitor it, because everything's coded and automated. So when you do that, you can monitor it thousands at a time, and then you've just got to sort through those and work out what works, what doesn't work.
So instead of having, 1 or 2 strategies, you've got lots, and you're trying to make small amounts of profit on or whatever,
yeah,
on as many of those as possible. Is that the approach?
Yep, and I'll have models that are built on the outputs from other models. So I might have a model for a 1200 distance, a model for maidens, a model for group ones, a model for the US markets, a model for Australian markets, a model where it's based on last start winners and how many are in the race, lots of different things like that. And then they'll feed into other models, and you can basically come up with an unlimited number of combinations of what you've got.
So you talked about using other people's inputs, so tips, ratings from other people. For the audience, because I know this is always a fun one to then go away and sort of run your own things on. Any particular ones you'd recommend people take a look at without giving away your age, obviously?
Most of them fail.
Yeah.
Everything that's out there that's free generally fails. That doesn't mean that there's not a subset or a niche where they do work.
Mm-hmm.
It could be a track, it could be a style of race, it could
or a price range.
Yep, it just depends. I'll grab the ones that come off Betfair. I'll grab the ones that are at TAB. If it's generally via an API, it's a lot easier to grab.
Tell me about it. Yeah, anything can avoid scraping is a good idea. Cool. Well, thank you. Jace, let's grab you back in. Now, I'm going to start, we've got some questions there, and I promise we'll come to them. But we're going to start with one of my favourite debate topics. It was really interesting. This huge debate flared up on this on Slack a couple of weeks ago. It was hilarious because we'd had the same debate in the office back when we were in the office, and it literally went on for weeks. Primarily one of our data scientists and one of our reporting analysts, who are both very opinionated, very smart guys. They had 2 different sides of the same opinion. And it went on for weeks and weeks, and I'm not sure we even came to a final solution on it, how we thought turnover should be calculated. So it's interesting, especially in this community, when we're sharing opinions, thoughts and experiences, but we're not all actually sharing the same language. So we talk a lot about profit on turnover, and about, how much you're turning over. But especially as soon as you bring in lay bets to a calculation, a lot of us don't actually derive our calculation for turnover the same way. So my question to you is, how do you define turnover, which back in the day, for, if you're just back betting, is generally defined as the stake you've put down. If you've put down $100 at 2s, your turnover is $100. But how do you derive that? You both, you lay as well as you back. What's your definition of turnover, and what's your opinion on the bigger sort of discussion point? Jason, maybe to you, because I just talked for.
Yeah. My answer is probably going to be a bit of a cop-out. I don't think it really matters how you define it, just as long as you know what you're measuring. I think for a ASL game or a game where there's only 2 outcomes, I think it's probably a bit clearer. I think for me, turnover is the liability you have on the match. It seems a bit silly that if you're betting on a team and you're backing it, as opposed to laying the other team, that you suddenly have a different definition of what a turnover is. Whereas if you use the liability you have on the match, it's consistent. Whether you back or lay it, it's going to give you the same answer. I think where it gets a bit iffy and where I've used different definitions of it is for horse racing or things where there's multiple outcomes. Just because, turnover, when you're laying something that's 10 to 1, 20 to 1, and then you're trying to match it with what your results are with back betting, it probably isn't as relevant. Obviously, your lay betting turnover is going to be much higher, and your profit on turnover is going to be much lower. So if you're trying to combine the two, it's probably going to give you a bit of a distorted result. So that's where I do sometimes use the stake. The stake, as Betfair defines it, as my denominator rather than the liability. But at the end of the day, I don't think it really matters, just as long as you know what you're measuring and for what purpose.
Paul, what about you?
So I think it's liability. It's whatever you are going to lose on that race, that sports event, whether you're backing or laying, it's what you have actually staked to lose. And that's what I use.
Even if you're laying a really short priced runner and your liability, therefore, at one level is less risky than if you were.
So if you're
risky,
laying,
depending on how you look at it.
You're laying something at $1 and you put $1,000 on it, you're only going to lose $10.
Yep. So you think that it's a $10 turnover?
That's a $10 turnover. That's what you're risking.
Because some of the debate, and this is where we got to in the office, was that we felt that either extreme was probably a bit too extreme, that just using the stake was unfair to laying. Just using the liability was a bit unfair to the likelihood of an outcome. So we then got into, well, then you might need to consider the price that you're laying at, and it got very complicated. I think
in the end, so the way I say it is, in the end, if you've lost $10,000 on a bet, that's $10,000 out of your account. That was
or 10,000 of turnover.
Yeah.
No, it's fair. Yeah, I think it's one I'd love to continue and pick up again in Slack for anyone who didn't have a chance to sort of have an opinion last time round. Part of what I'm hearing from both of you is that in some respects, maybe simple's better, and that as long as you're clear on what it is, a simple equation is easier to share and easier to understand.
That's right.
Even if it's capital liability, but it's still, it's something that everyone can calculate without having to think about too much.
Yep.
Cool. I am keen to hear other opinions on that as well. All right, the other one from me before we open more widely to this set of questions that keeps getting longer, which is good. I'd like to, this is a question from Ewan, ask about your biggest flops. So where you've built a model, you've got all these wonderful high hopes, and then when you turn it on, the reality has been a long way away from what you expected it to be. So Paul, I know that you've got one on US racing. What's your story? I haven't heard this story yet.
Yeah, so US racing is kind of one of those areas that I go into and then I pull back from and attack again. It's just one of those markets where the liability can either be really good or really bad, depending on the race. And if you hit those low liability races and you even put on a small bet, and I'm talking $30 minimum liability for SP, the odds can jump from let's say $20 to $60 if you're laying it, or it could bring it in from 20 to 8. It makes a big difference on those low liability markets. So I've had models that have played in there. They work tremendously, especially on the lay side. And then you go put them in and you just keep losing money and it just keeps going out the door. And you look at it and you can't understand why, and then you stop it, and then the model starts working again. And then you just go at it again and go for a few more months thinking it's going to get better, and it just never does.
I think the takeaway is that US racing is interesting. I'm always, in awe of anyone who can make money on US racing.
Especially with the start times, not ever lining up.
Jason and I were debating that the other day, how you actually try and derive some vague, estimation of when a US race starts.
It's a nightmare.
Yeah. So that was a poor outcome, you'd say, based on
yes,
your.
I do make a good profit on the US racing overall, but lost a lot there too.
And Jason, what's your big flop?
I mean, I probably want to say it's a huge flop, but what I was alluding to before with the greyhound racing, I built a model which on the back test using BSP as the price was generating a pretty healthy ROI. When I put into action, I didn't realize how much, I always knew I was going to affect the BSP, but I didn't realize how much I was going to affect the BSP. So I guess the execution in terms of betting with the bot, I had to refine a bit and just realize that I can't push it too hard compared to something like horse racing. That was probably a pretty big lesson just in terms of execution. I had never dealt with something that illiquid before, so that was a pretty big lesson for me.
Question from me on that, and this is to both of you. So obviously the market's changed. Now, COVID was a really interesting example of that. When everyone around the world suddenly got locked down and there weren't any markets anywhere, except in Australia, suddenly our markets went nuts. Now, obviously that's a really stark example of how our markets can change very quickly. Now, it's easy enough to come back and review, your model implementation when you know that things have changed, i.e. recently. But when things change over a longer period, it can be much harder to see that change. Now, greyhounds is a really good example. The liquidity on greyhounds over the last sort of 12 to 18 months has grown hugely, even before COVID came along. How often do you go back and review the markets to see whether the things that you're still considering as truths are still truth? What do you, Jace, maybe on the greyhound?
I analyze pretty often. So at the end of every week, I have a script that will analyze my results against BSP. And I know BSP is not the greatest tool for greyhounds, but it's better than just, I guess, pure results. I think the problem with, no, I'm in the dark now, but I think the problem with pure results, especially for horse racing and greyhound racing, is that it's really variable. You could go a whole month without winning, and it doesn't mean that you're having a losing model. On the flip side, you could be winning a lot and you could have a losing model. So I like to assess on something a bit more that isn't that impacted by variance, and BSP or tote prices is something that I assess against. So especially with greyhounds, where I think things are evolving, people that are a bit smarter are getting into it now. I'll assess it pretty regularly just to see that the edge that I thought I had is still there.
And Paul, you say that you look at your models every day. Is that part of what you consider, how the market's changing inputs?
So I'm generally looking at stuff like how many days I've been in drawdown, if I'm losing, how the weeks are trending, are they doing what I expect? So I'll have a week by week kind of analysis, charts for all the systems. Visuals really help when you're using models to see how it goes. Then you can see the trends which are changing. It's very hard to sometimes.
What do you use?
Results. So I'm using Power BI.
Yep.
Desktop.
And Jace, what about you? Where do you?
I just use Python scripts to visualize and my analysis.
It's funny. It's a very different. Last time, our last meetup, we had John Lowe and Tom Bishop, and they had different approaches again. So we had R and we had, I think, Excel, basically, the different variations on the theme, which is it's great. It shows the breadth of how we use these different tools. So I'm going to start pulling some of these questions out. So we mentioned COVID. So there was a question here very specifically about, do you guys think that COVID has significantly affected particularly the horse racing markets in Australia? I've got my opinion, but that's not the point here.
Definitely. my turnover dropped to about a third of what it was, just because the markets were acting differently. Didn't feel right. The average price of winners was going up. And if you're laying, that's a bit of a problem, which my average losers, I guess, because I was laying a lot, was going up. So I cut my betting back significantly up until probably last month. Things started to feel a bit better. There were still issues with South African racing. There was, I think the first day they came back, there were like 3 or 4 100 to 1 plus winners. So the markets completely reacted differently. Form factors obviously were a mess because horses were off for
like AFL.
Yep. So it made a big difference. So I cut back. This month I'm probably back to 60, 70% by the end of this month of my turnover. And hopefully next month I'll get back up to where I was pre-COVID.
Jace, what about you? Have you seen any differences?
I probably had the opposite experience at the peak of COVID. I probably had a lot more turnover, and that's just because for greyhounds, I wasn't chasing a price in. There seemed to be a lot more people willing to take my price. Whereas now, even now with sports coming back and a bit less, I think probably a bit less turnover, or a bit less recreational turnover, I feel like I'm chasing prices down and people aren't matching it as willingly as the peak of COVID.
Okay. On to staking. So when you're looking at staking, what's your approach? Do you bet a percentage of your bank? Do you use Kelly? Do you use flat staking? What's your approach, and is it related to your bank size? So Paul, you said that you started with $100, like, which I still love as a story. That is one of my favorite success stories. And you said that it makes your wife a bit happier too. Which is always part of the equation. What's your approach to staking?
So I guess my approach now is level stakes for my models, or
different models.
So I have different models, yeah. So different models, they kind of stack up the stake on top of each other to a certain point, and then I'll have a maximum bet size that I will have that's a percentage of my bank. But I think it depends on where you are as a punter. So if you're just starting out and you're going to lose $100, well, you can probably use a bit more fancy staking and use a little bit of progression, not too much. Because if you lose $100, it's $100. You can go work the next day, you get your $100 back. When you start to get to the large figures, and I'm talking like 4 or 5 figures, it's not so much fun to go tell your wife that you've lost $10,000. Played somewhere in the world that you had no idea, and that's just what the model did.
And in terms of that risk approach, so you said earlier that your first 10 years were a little bit of a throwaway, partly because you didn't necessarily have that risk appetite. For you, do you stake your models considering that? Like, do you look at what your worst variance looks like and go, well, I could kind of cope with that? And I don't mean financially, I mean as much as anything psychologically, or, how do you...
It's a psychological issue. I tended to, like, I can remember when $20 loss hurt, then that $20 to 100, and you get that to 1,000, then you get that to 5,000, and you just keep going. But each new big loss hurts.
Yeah. That's I think pretty consistent across almost everyone, that everyone still feels those losses, even a long way in.
It doesn't matter what you do. You can treat it as a unit, size or a percentage of your bank, and it doesn't matter. It's a new number and what you could have spent it on.
Would you, or what your wife could have spent it on. Would you give us a ballpark of percentage of bank that you might be prepared to risk on one event?
So on one event, if I was really, really confident, up to 4%. Cool. But generally it's less than 1%. And generally it's probably more like 0.1%, on any particular market. but I can go big in some markets if I'm confident with models.
There's some good numbers. How about you, Jason? What's your approach to staking?
Probably kind of similar. I probably use a version of Kelly for most of my staking, but for something like greyhounds, I'll probably risk a certain liability. Two reasons for that. Number one, I probably can't get as much as I would like to get matched compared to, say, an AFL match. And two, I think greyhounds especially, it's something where if your model says you have a bigger edge, you don't necessarily have a bigger edge. It just means you're missing something that someone else knows. So they're probably the biggest losses that you do have are the ones where you have the biggest edges, just because there's a trial that another dog had, or the dog's injured, and you'll never know that. And I think you just can't push a greyhound race like you'd push another sport where there's probably less unknown factors. Not saying there's not, but there's probably less so. In terms of how much I stake, I probably am a bit more risk averse than Paul in terms of this maximum. I'll stake probably around 2% of my bank at my max, but on any one given event or race, I'll probably stake at least 0.5%.
I like that you're both, they're still similar ballparks, the numbers that you're playing.
Yeah.
I think that also shows to long-term success that bank management is actually really important. Okay, talking about when you bet as opposed to what you bet, when do you place the bulk of your bets? Is it well pre-play? And obviously we might want to separate these answers into racing versus sport. But is it well pre-play? Is it in the last, death knell before the jump? Or is it in play? There are a couple of questions about in play, whether you only do pre-play, whether you bet in play as well. I'll add in a question there about whether you use SP for any or all of your betting, because I think it's related. Paul, how about over to you?
Yep. So generally about 40 seconds before the market starts, I'll start collecting the data and running it through the models. And about 10 seconds before the market goes off, I will look at what the prices are, compare it to the models, and then make an assessment. And most of my bets would go on at SP, just because I want to get matched. And I know at that point in time, with 10 seconds to go, it's going to be close enough. The SP is going to be similar to what's available, and I can get on the large amounts that I need. As far as in play, it's a bit harder. In running's okay, but in play for sports with the Australian rule where you have to call up is quite annoying. Hope they eventually do change that. So, yeah. So in play, it's generally only bets that I've done because I'm watching the game.
Yeah. So it's more of a hobby punt as opposed to.
It's an educated guess. Yeah.
How about the racing? Do you do much in run on racing?
Not really. I've generally moved on to the next race, and I'm just waiting for that to start.
We're focusing pre-play. How about you, Jay?
For sports, I probably start trickling it on the morning of the game. Mm-hmm. And then once final teams are out, I'll probably get the remainder of the what I want matched just on at one of the bookies or on Betfair. For racing, probably similar to Paul, I'll start monitoring the markets about 60 seconds out, and then I'll start trickling bets on depending on how liquid the market is. And most of my bets would probably come in with the last 20 seconds. Bit of a difference though, I don't use SP at all. So everything is matched.
And is that you just taking prices or offering prices? I mean, if you're offering and you don't get on, you just don't get on? Is that the deal?
Yeah. Sometimes if I'm chasing a price down and then it just keeps coming down, I just won't get my full stake on. And that's just unfortunate.
Where we should be using limit SP bets, but
Yeah, maybe.
Well, I'll jump back to you because there's a good question here that I'd like your opinion on. This is a opinion that's pretty persistent across the community. So it says, why do you use BSP as a benchmark, given that you can't trade into BSP with any volume? Now, I would challenge that, given I know the size of some of your bets, Paul. What's your opinion of actually placing, you're not talking 10, 20, $100. What's your opinion on BSP for real volume?
So I think I've gone, well, it depends on the market, obviously. If it's a highly liquid market, you can get any money on. Go to the Melbourne Cup, you could put, hundreds of thousands of dollars on it. As far as the general racing, I'm easily getting on $5,000 without impacting the BFSP. And that obviously depends on the horse that you're trying to put it on.
Yeah, and price range, like when we're talking price range, ballpark, what sort of price are you betting? $3 to $5 shots, $10 to $15, $30 shots, like?
I'll generally, I like to take a lot of the horses in a race, so I'll be laying those horses that I haven't taken. So in an 8-horse race, I'll probably be on 5, 6 horses.
Yep.
And in that case, it's easier just to lay the other 2 horses for the amount that I would have backed the other.
Yeah, horse for anyway. So you're saying that you're laying quite a range of prices, yeah?
That's right.
To achieve that, and you're getting on for decent sizes.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think this is one where, I was sort of alluding to this, I guess, earlier in my question about how markets change. I think that the BSP is a really good example of that obviously you're not going to be able to get on for what you want at the price you want in every market, but there is an awful lot more liquidity at SP than there was once upon a time.
That's right. And I'm on a lot of markets. I'm getting every market there is almost in racing. There wouldn't be many that I miss all day long.
Do you just use straight SP or do you use limit SP? Because my opinion is that limit SP is really underutilized as...
So I've done both. I went through a stage where I used limit SP solely.
Yep.
But I found that I was missing some profit.
Yep.
It wasn't as a huge amount of profit, but I decided to just go SP in the end.
So I think that limit SP can be a good way, especially if you're a little risk averse, in terms of not trusting the price, can make you a bit more comfortable until, like you say, you're just happy to trust it. Question here: do you guys only use Betfair, or do you also bet with the corps? And if so, is your timing different with the corps than to us when you place bets? Obviously, you don't need to be specific about who you may be betting with, given that you don't necessarily want to get gubbed.
I'll go first. I use the corps, especially when there's minimum bet laws. For the bigger overlays, I'll use the corporates pretty extensively and just get the remainder matched on Betfair. For the smaller overlays where I don't think the corps, where the fixed prices are going to come in, I'll use Betfair because I'm generally going to get a better price.
Cool.
I'll say it depends on the price range.
Mm-hmm.
If it's outside of probably $30 plus, Betfair, you're going to get a much better price. Mm-hmm. If it's coming in on the short end, sometimes the corporates can match the price with Betfair. Yeah, so it just depends. But generally, most of my money would be going through Betfair because it has a lot more markets.
And the API automation thing.
Exactly.
We don't break you all the time. I'm not biased, but do you ever go against your model's predictions? I know that Jason has had opinions on AFL that have gone against in the past. Do you have examples of where it did or didn't pay out?
I used to for AFL. I used to have what I called a qualitative overlay, which was terrible. I'd assess afterwards and figure out that was negative EV, and then I've quickly done away with that. So I no longer trust my eye because I'm sure everyone else has a better eye than me. So it's usually paid to go against the public, and I'm just as public as anyone else.
I like that. How about you, Paul?
No, everything's automated. It does it without me watching.
I love that. All right, I like this one. This is a bit more sort of technical on that end of the spectrum. Can you talk a little bit about your tech stack, what programming languages you're using, both for your model building, maybe for, actually I assume for both of you, your database management and your automation, those sort of three parts of the pipeline? Maybe, Paul, do you want to talk? I don't know much.
So a lot of mine was written a long time ago, so Java.
Nothing wrong with Java. Thank you very much.
Yeah, apart from this week when Keep Alive didn't work. Yeah, so mainly Java, but that's just because as a software developer, that's what I knew at the time. But I'll also use the Jupyter notebooks with Python, with pandas and Skykit in there. As far as what I actually run it on, it all runs on a laptop. Up until probably a year ago, I would just buy a new laptop every year.
You're killing me.
$300, and it would just sit there and run 24/7, and that was my backup. Next year I'd buy another laptop and copy all the code over.
Are you still doing that, or have we managed
I bought a bit more upgraded laptop this time, but yeah, I'd still do it.
Oh, good God. All right, well, later we'll talk about hosting options, okay? Pros and cons. How about you, Jace? What does your tech stack look like?
So I'm probably not as sophisticated as Paul, but I do most of all of my dev in Python. So just locally, using Spider in particular, which is pretty nice. It's kind of like, if most people, I'm guessing, use R, it's kind of like RStudio for Python. I run all my automated stuff off AWS, and that works pretty well. My stuff's pretty hacky though, so 1 out of 20 ideas will work, and I don't comment things very well. I don't really remember what I've done.
Not sure I know a dev who does comment well, so
yeah, exactly. But I think there is actually merit in that. Well, I try to justify it to myself that there is that if I was going through 19 failed ideas and trying to do it perfectly, it's going to take a lot of time. So if I'm just hacking away, just trying to see if it works in a very back of the envelope way, I'm okay doing that. And once I found something that has worked, I'll do it more properly and make sure that there's no data leakage.
I completely support that. I think particularly people coming from a dev background, and that's not you, which is possibly why. But I have a lot of people who come in as devs who want everything to be neat and shiny and all, sort of A grade before they hit go, and that makes things take so much longer. Where you could have iterated through a dozen, poorly implemented but still basically the same outcome versions, and then once you find the one that's profitable, you can then iterate. You can put the time in, you can make it, you can optimize it, you can make it faster, you can host it, you can do all of that. You can add the stream, you can, whereas if you try and do it all to begin with, I wonder how many people have just stopped because it was all too hard to get.
And I think that's a good way to get demoralized as well. If you're going through all that effort to come up with a proper pipeline just to figure out it doesn't work. Yeah, I think that's how you lose a customer.
And I love that you say that, Jason, someone who, is, you've got the history, you've got the runs, you've done this well. So nice to not just have me saying that. Question here about percentage above, below fair price. So if you have what you're considering a rated price, what would you have as your minimum that you'd accept as your margin above or below that if you're backing versus laying? Let's say for racing. Do you have a ballpark? Is it 5%? Is it 10%? Like, does it vary based on price range? I hope it does. Opinions? Maybe Paul, your turn.
Yes, I'm generally looking for anything from 1 to probably 3 or 4% max. Once it's outside that 4% above, I'm a bit wary of what the market knows that I don't know. So I'm trying to be in line with the market, and just take out those little edges where it's got it slightly wrong.
So you're trying to keep pretty close. And does that vary in price range? So like, my opinion is that 10% at $2 is very different to 10% at $20.
So So when I say that, you have to convert the price to a percentage. So
Okay. You're starting with that.
is 5%. So you're generally going to 8% of that. So 8 down to.
And Jason, what about you? Do you have the same approach?
I kind of let the back test take care of that. So depending on the sport, it's going to be different. Certain overlays are going to be more or less profitable for different sports. So I kind of just like back test, let me know what to bet and what overlay to bet.
Talking about racing, do you have circumstances where you might use a weighted average price compared to BSP as your benchmark? Or do you just use BSP instead, or a combination of both?
Mainly I just use BSP, but I mean, it's probably is a good suggestion, especially for greyhounds. Yeah, it's something that I haven't really explored too much. I just use BSP for the truth in most cases, but I think for horse racing you can just rely on BSP, but for other sports that are less liquid, you probably can't. So I think it probably is a good point.
Paul, do you have an opinion?
Yeah, I'd go BFSP generally. It's easier. That's the only reason why.
Okay, I'm absolutely getting inundated with these. We're not going to be able to get through all of them, but I'm trying to pull some eyes out of it. And this is not saying that some of them are good or bad. It's just the ones that are picking me up. So I love this one. This is sort of a how long's a piece of string. When are you confident enough in a strategy system to go live? How do you backtest? Do you use multiple statistical tests on historical data? Do you monitor on live markets for a specific period of time? If so, how many markets? Do you have how do you backtest? How long do you backtest? And when you're ready to, go live? Jace, do you?
I'm a big proponent of going live as soon as possible. I think you do learn things that you don't learn just looking at a backtest. The biggest one being how much you affect the market. But I think there are a lot of other things such as timing that you do get a better feel on once you go live. And I'm not saying go live with crazy stakes. Go live with small stakes you can ramp up. Because it does give you some confidence as well. But yeah, I'm a big proponent of just going live as soon as you think you have a profitable model. The worst case scenario is you lose like $50 or something. Not a big deal.
How long would you run that for? Like that's the hard thing with variance and so on. When do you feel that even a live testing?
Yeah.
Actually.
I mean, luckily with horse racing or greyhounds in particular, there are so many markets. So if you're betting on a large proportion of them, I think if you're betting on every single market, you're probably betting on like 1,000 markets, 1,000 markets a week or something ridiculous like that. If you take into account UK as well, so it doesn't actually take too long for you to get a good sense on whether your strategy is going to work or isn't going to work. And like I said, you're going to figure out things along the way of what you didn't expect, and that's going to be pretty invaluable.
And Paul, you're similar, aren't you? You said earlier, that you'll try something live for a while and then look at the results.
Yeah, so I'll generally have the data to back it up, and I'll run some statistical tests against it, graph it over weeks, make sure it's all okay, and then I'll go live. But that for me could be, a few hours testing in the morning, and I'll stick it on before I go to work live and see how it goes through the day.
I assume you both use the strategy ref and or customer bet references to help you. Oh my God. You and I need to have a conversation.
No, because I've got it all coded on my side. So every bet ID that goes on, I'm monitoring. Like I think I bet 730 something systems at the moment. So
there are easier ways to track it.
But combinations of those, the permutations, it's just too high. I can store it in my database and it's done.
Oh, I love it. I absolutely love it. One of the things I love most about this sort of thing is that, Paul, you're a super good example of this. You are profitable. You've been profitable for a long time and you are good at what you do. And there is still, a lot of things that you could potentially, do differently, implement, iterate, improve, whichever words you want to use. You don't pretend to be perfect in how you do things.
No, I'd rather spend the time on the analysis and just throw things in.
Maybe that's the lesson here. In terms of efficiency improvement, Paul, we know what your answer is, so I'm going to ask Jason. You use hosting in the UK, you said for your automated things, presumably that's partly for the latency. What do you find the difference to be between the latency from Australia and the latency via, say, AWS in the UK?
I think the last time I tested the latency from the UK was like 12, and off my local computer running off Australia was like 400, so pretty big difference.
I've had as bad as 800 recently from Australia. Versus, I'm getting 12, and that's from a fairly generic AWS server. So yes, it is an option, and if you need support, reach out and we can help.
Yeah.
Person asking. So you guys, Jace, I know that you've worked with other people. The question is, do you work alone or are you part of a bigger team who bet together and or model together? The phrase here is like-minded geniuses. I like that. I'm putting you both as geniuses. Jace, I know you had some mates you did some things with early on. Do you still do things with other people or are you a bit more of a loner?
I work alone mainly. For some projects I work with other people on, but most of my stuff is alone. I probably guess maybe 20% of my stuff is other people and 80% is just myself. And
how do you, so obviously answer this to the level that you're comfortable, but I know that in the past you stopped working for a while outside of your wagering to, focus on this. You went back at one point. How do you find balancing doing all this on your own? I know at one level it's a fairly personal question, but it is a very real consideration for people thinking about doing this professionally. I mean, Paul keeps a day job, and I wonder whether that's partly for the sanity of not being on your own. How do you manage that?
I think now it's a lot better. So I'm working out of a co-working space now, so that kind of eliminates the social aspect of hunting professionally that I had before. Like you kind of miss that social aspect of just sit at home all day. The other part of it is most of my stuff is now automated. So I'm super flexible in what I do. Like I don't really have to do much at all on a day if I don't want to. But if I do want to do something, I can just turn on the laptop anywhere I want and just do some analysis. Whereas when I first started, I was probably a bit less on the automation. So it felt more like a job and a chore, whereas it's a bit more freeing now that I can work to my own schedule and basically do what I want when I want.
What about you, Paul? I mean, there are two sides to this. Do you work alone? And B, if you work alone, are there challenges to that? How do you balance that?
Yeah, so I'm just one-man team. I do talk to other people over emails and on the Slack channel and through forums and stuff like that about punting, but it's never down to specifics about what I'm modeling, or I'm happy to give some advice when people ask. But yeah, I like to work during the day. I get that social aspect. I like the job that I've got. It keeps a regular income on the side, and then anything I get from punting is just profit.
A nice way of being. And I hate to say it, but this is going to be the last question because I promised you guys I'd stick to an hour. So think about your answer here, and then if you have any other questions, guys, do shoot them through, and I will put them in the Slack channel afterwards if you want to jump on there, and the guys will give you their thoughts. But how important relatively do you find feature selection and engineering versus model selection or tuning? So basically, where do you feel the most return on your investment is when it comes to your time? So earlier, you both basically said you'd prefer to work on the model dev than the automation dev. The same principle, engineering versus selection versus tuning. Opinions?
I can go. Yep. I think for me, 100%, it would be the data and the feature selection. I think in terms of building a model tuning, you can basically, and it's so easy now, you can just install a package and just run it through the package without really knowing too much about it. I think where the edge really comes from is coming up with getting data or deriving your own data from other data that forms a variable or a feature that goes into your model. I think, especially as, I mean, the answer probably would have been different 5 years ago, but I think now with everything so ready at your fingertips, I think model selection is a bit less important in my opinion.
What about you, Paul?
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely the data you get, and it's what you do with that data and the extra features that you can derive from that data. So there's a lot of stuff that you can do off the free data that's out there and derive it to, I'll give an example. So it's very hard to find how a horse has performed at that particular prize money race previously. There's something you can derive pretty quickly, and it's a feature that does quite well.
Oh, there's your tip for the evening. Nice end. Thank you. I said I'd keep it to an hour, and I did. Thank you both very, very much. I'm very grateful to you both for giving your time, for giving your input and your opinions, for letting me record this. That is incredibly kind of you both, and for sharing your experience and opinions with the wider community, not just here, but more generally. You're both always willing to jump in and give thoughts and advice, and I think that's really cool of you guys, and the wider community opinion to being open and pretty giving of experience and opinions. I think, yeah, you guys are both perfect examples of that, and I'm very grateful to you both. And I owe you both a drink when we're allowed back.
When that happens.
Again. God knows when I'll be allowed to visit, but someday we will. Yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed that as much as I did. I know that's a really cliched thing to say, but I really love this. This is a real highlight of my role and what I get to do. Hopefully we get to continue the conversation a bit more generally on the Slack channel. If you're not there, please, feel free to join if you want a bit more community and people to talk to about, experience and opinions and how to define turnover. If you don't have an invitation or know someone already in there, feel free to shoot us an email. So pretty sure Ben shared in the chat, but it's api@betfair.com.au will get us pretty easily. More generally, if there's anything else that we at Betfair can do to help you guys, and I'm going to say the audience, please let us know. That's what we're here for. Our automation team, that's our catchphrase, is me and Ben, and we have a third person joining our team, Ash, in the next couple of weeks as well. This is what we're here to do, is to help you guys be better, be smarter, be more successful, including getting you access to things like data for you to model, and the API if and when you're ready to go down that rabbit hole. So let us know. We can't help if we don't know. Otherwise, thank you all. Please stay safe in these crazy times, and I hope to see you guys on Slack, if not in person soon.
Thanks.
Thank you.